Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Tom. I am the Bald Bible Guy, and today we're going to start looking at this concept of death into life through the Gospels. Today specifically, we're going to look at the first instance that comes up in the Bible, in Scriptures, and that is the restoring to life of the daughter of Jairus, who's one of the a synagogue leader in the town. This story is actually covered in three different Gospels. It's covered in Mark chapter 5 that we'll be looking at today. It's covered in Matthew chapter 9. It's also covered in Luke chapter 8. So there's three different perspectives. Mark is what we're going to be going through today. It gives kind of the most detail of the three versions. So I want to read it and then we'll go through it. So this is Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. It says, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd had gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live.' So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. A woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed.' Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see people crowding all against you,' his disciples answered, 'and yet you ask, "Who touched me?"' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing that what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.' While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. 'Your daughter is dead,' they said. 'Why bother this teacher anymore?' Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue leader, 'Do not be afraid, just believe.' He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and he told them, 'Why all of this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep.' But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha koum,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, get up.' Immediately, the girl stood up and walked around. She was about 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished, and he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. So this story is kind of a few stories in one. And there's a couple takeaways, especially within the season of Lent, that we can have. Firstly, the first takeaway is that as we go through Lent and as we're preparing to celebrate Good Friday and Resurrection Day, we see these two people coming to meet Christ with an ailment, with an issue. One, the synagogue leader's daughter is dying or has passed, and the other woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. Both of them, I think this is really critical for us to see and for us to kind of absorb the way to approach Jesus. Both approached him humbly and submissively and dependently, uh, which for the woman, that's not so hard to imagine. Didn't want any commotion, and wouldn't want to make a scene. There was already a big crowd there. And that's easy enough to understand why she would just want to kind of come up and touch his cloak and get healed that way. But Jairus was a synagogue leader. This is a guy who has some position. He is well known. People know who he is. He probably has a little bit of wealth. He has responsibility. He has authority in the community. More so status wise, he has more status. He has more position than Jesus would have, and yet he approaches Jesus and falls at his feet and says, my daughter is sick, is dying. It says here, one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet. He fell at Jesus' feet and pleaded earnestly with him, my daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So, firstly, he comes in humbly and submissively. He comes in dependently, knowing that he doesn't necessarily deserve, he doesn't necessarily need to bother Jesus for this favor, but yet he also believes and is convinced that Jesus can heal his daughter, even though she's dying. And it's that belief and conviction and the need and the love of a father for his dying daughter that brings him to Jesus in that manner, falling at his feet, kind of prostrating and humbling, elevating Jesus and in that way. And this is something that you would not expect a man of stature, a man of position, a leader of the synagogue to do, not to just anybody. And so there's that recognition that Jesus is more than just a man, more than just a guy, that he has the power and authority, as we see later in the story. He has the power and the authority to restore life, not just healing. He healed many, many people with all kinds of different things, but specifically in this instance, that he healed death and dying. By the time they get to the house, she's passed away. They're already mourning. They're already, lamenting the passing of this daughter. It says later that there was a commotion. It says in verse 38, when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. When in that time period, when someone passed, they would mourn, obviously, but they would also have professional mourners that would come in and help the mourning and help the family. Kind of, we would say, celebrate the life of. Some of the other gospels say that there were people playing instruments, and so everyone had accepted that this girl had died. They were already mourning. The mourners were already there. Like, they knew this was a foregone conclusion. They knew before, and probably why Jairus went to seek out Christ is because she was dying, and they knew that she was going to die, and there wasn't anything that they could do. And yet, the faith of Jairus calls him to go seek Christ. And I think that's the second thing we see from both of these people in this story, is they have a belief that Jesus can fix their problem, that he can solve their issue, be it death or constant bleeding. And that belief convicts them to the point that they will earnestly and humbly seek Christ, both falling at his feet, both saying, I don't want to bother you, I don't want to pester you, I don't deserve you, and yet, could you do this thing for me? The woman, as we see, doesn't even ask. She just touches him. Her whole thought process is, if I just touch him, I'm going to get healed, and that's exactly what happened. Jesus, obviously, there knowing her thoughts and answering her call of faith. We'll get to that in a second. So by the time Jesus gets to the house, they're already mourning the death. And they laugh at him when Jesus says, yeah, she's not dead, she's just asleep. And they're like, what are you smoking? She's dead. Has been. That's why we're all here. She's been dying for a while, and this is how it is. And yet, very humbly also, Jesus says, no, everybody go outside. Just takes her parents and 3 of the disciples. So not even all the disciples were there. It's just Peter, James, and John. And they go, and he says to the girl, get up. And she does. There's no hocus pocus. There's no abracadabra. It's just a very simple, like, hey, wake up. And we'll see as we look through the restoration to life of the widow of Nain's son and Lazarus. That's a key phrase that Jesus keeps saying. Get up. Come out. Hey, wake up. And that's all it takes for Jesus to exercise his authority and his power over even death itself. It's really, really incredible thing. And I think it's so cool also that in the middle of that story, Jesus gets interrupted by this woman in the crowd who's been bleeding for 12 years. She's gone to doctors. They can't do anything. It's just getting worse. She's penniless now because she's done everything that she can, and nothing has worked. In fact, it's actually gotten worse. And she thinks to herself, if I just go find this Jesus guy, and if I just touch his cloak, then I'll be healed. I don't need to ask him anything. I don't need him to do anything. If I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And so she goes through the crowd. There's a big crowd. They're already going to Jairus' house to see this daughter. And she goes up to him and she just grabs the end of his cloak. And Jesus says he felt the healing go out from him. And he felt the power go out from him. Now, I am of the opinion that Jesus knew who she was, knew she was there, knew what she wanted, and provided that healing as soon as she touched his cloak. He turns around and says, who touched me? I am of the opinion that he knew who touched him and what she wanted and what she needed and what she was healed of. But he asks, and he presses the asking so that one, the crowd and the disciples could see and witness, know the story, number one, and number two, so that we could see also. So he asks, he says, who touched me? And nobody says anything, and the disciples are like, dude, there's all kinds of people crowding around, like everybody's touching you. And he was like, no, somebody touched me. Again, because he wants to bring this story, he wants to use this as a teaching moment. So the woman finally comes forward, and then, like the synagogue leader, falls at Jesus' feet and says, I'm so sorry. I touched your cloak because I've been bleeding for 12 years and nothing has been done about it. And as soon as I touched you, I was healed. And Like I can feel it. I know that I'm healed. And Jesus says to her, very, very cool, he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. So the faith that Jesus is talking about there is a reassurance to her that yes, she was correct. She is healed. She felt like she was healed, just like she thought she would be. And Jesus is confirming that, like, yes, you're correct. Your thought process was correct. Your healing is correct. Yes, I healed you. But specifically there, when he says your faith has healed you, what Jesus is talking about there is her response to her belief and her convictions. Because that's all faith is. Faith is your living response to your convictions based on your faith. Both Jairus and the woman both responded in faith to their convictions based on their belief. Both of them had an issue. Daughter was dead, bleeding for 12 years. Both of them believed and were convicted and convinced that Jesus could restore life to his daughter, that Jesus could heal the bleeding for 12 years. And that belief and conviction drove them and caused them to respond by going to seek Jesus humbly and submissively and obediently, and to prostrate themselves before him with their needs, with their worries, their fears, and all of those things. And that's, especially in the season of Lent, what is so important for us to see here. That whatever we have, that response of faith, to really examine our beliefs and our convictions. What is it that we really believe about Jesus, about Christ? How are we convicted in that, and how can we respond in faith, in humility, in obedience, in submission to Christ? Because it's that response of faith, of going to Christ, especially in the season of Lent, as we prepare for the celebration of the death and crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. How can we look at ourselves and purify ourselves and meditate on the Word and those scriptures to cleanse ourselves? And I think those are a couple of the big takeaways. What is it that we actually believe? How convicted are we of those things? Number one, how are we responding to those things? How do we respond to the life, death, and crucifixion, resurrection of Christ? How are we convicted by what Jesus did for us on the cross? And then how are we living differently because of it? Or are we living differently because of it? Number two is, how are we approaching Christ? How do we approach the Word? How do we approach church? How do we approach Jesus? Do we do it the way that we see here, humbly and submissively, obediently, dependently on Christ? And lastly, how often or how much do we think about what we're thinking about today? How often do we reflect on, wow, what an amazing gift of grace that we have in Christ through the Spirit? That's really the meaning of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, is the gift of grace bestowed to us in Christ through the Spirit by believing and responding in faith to that message, humbly and obediently and submissively going to Christ, repenting of our past sins, realizing that we have a dependence on Him, and by that response of faith, gaining the gift of grace that Jesus bestows on all of us. So I hope you will join me again. Next week we'll be going over the restoration of life to the widow of Nain's son. That's in Luke. As we continue through Lent and looking at preparing ourselves for the celebration of Holy Week, of Good Friday, and finally Resurrection Sunday. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and I will see you next week. Till then, God bless. Take care.